My name is Vincent, and I'm with the newest chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, the Olympia chapter. And I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules to make it out tonight. When the planning for all this began, I thought we'd be fortunate just to have enough people to make a minyan, and this is beyond my wildest dreams. I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to quickly introduce Jewish Voice for Peace for those who are unfamiliar with our organization. Jewish Voice for Peace is a diverse and democratic community of activists inspired by Jewish tradition to work together for peace, social justice, and human rights. We support the aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians for security and self-determination. JVP opposes anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, and anti-Arab bigotry and oppression. JVP seeks an end to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, security and self-determination for Israelis and Palestinians, a just solution for Palestinian refugees based on principles established in international law, and an end to violence against civilians, and peace and justice for all peoples in the Middle East. We believe it is completely in line with Jewish tradition and ethics to directly challenge Israel's military occupation and the American institutions that support it. We draw from the history of many Jewish communities and individuals throughout history who have stood up against injustice whenever and wherever they were confronted with it. I personally have always felt that the Kabbalistic concept of tikkun olam, the concept that it is our responsibility to rebuild the holiness of our world by working within the world, has been a force underlying all social justice movements since time immemorial. That's why I'm proud to be a member of JVP. Now, of course, our featured guest. In a few moments, we will all meet Dr. Dorothy Naor. Quick explanation. A few days ago, Dorothy suffered an accident and fell, sustaining injuries to her face. Fortunately, she has told us she's not in any pain, and besides her appearance, she feels great. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say we all wish her a full and speedy recovery. At any rate, we're blessed to have such a colorful speaker with us tonight. Dorothy immigrated from the U.S. to Israel in 1958 after her marriage to an Israeli who, in 1939, fled the threat to his Jewish family in Austria following Kristallnacht. Dorothy describes herself as from the generation of the Shoah and one who believed that Jews needed a country of their own. She completed her PhD at Tel Aviv University and was an English teacher during her professional life. In October 2000, when events claimed the lives of 12 Palestinian Israeli citizens at the hands of Israeli police, Dorothy began to deeply question her country's policies and actions. These events, and her increasing concern about endless Israeli wars, led her to a new profile, a feminist organization with both female and male members, who challenge militarism in Israeli society and seek to transform the country from a militaristic society to a civilized one. Today, Dorothy works tirelessly with New Profile to educate others about the realities and costs of the Israeli occupation, leads informal tours to the villages of her West Bank Palestinian friends, and supports youth who question compulsory military service. Dorothy states, "As a citizen, it is my responsibility to censor what I believe is wrong and to try to correct the situation. If I can plant a single seed, I'll have gotten somewhere." There will be a Q&A after the presentation, so we ask that you please hold your questions until then. Without further ado, let's give a big round of applause for Dr. Dorothy Naor.
I said I'm unused to the doctor business. I'm just plain Dorothy, okay? I don't like formalities for some reason or other. I must say I'm very impressed with Olympia. I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to come here. I thank all of you for inviting me and for being here tonight. I hope that you will not be disappointed. Where to begin? A few corrections about it didn't go quite so fast. It took me a long time. I started questioning way before 2000. 2000 was the straw that broke the camel's back. I finally started learning. One reason I didn't do that before, we were traveling a lot. We lived in this country, that country, the other country because of my husband's work. Our kids were growing up. I was studying. I was teaching. There just wasn't time to go and do the nitty-gritty of reading. 2000, when the Israeli police killed Arab demonstrators finished it for me. It reminded me very much of Kent State University. I'm, after all, also American. And I didn't know where to put myself. And a friend of mine said, well, there are some people going to pay condolence visits. Would you like to join them? And I said, yes, and that was my introduction to New Profile. That evening was a very important evening in my life because the people who received us, whom we went to, received us very well. It was a very traumatic experience. In one house, the boy that was killed was an 18-year-old who had not been participating at all in the demonstration. He was sitting up on the top of the hill watching, and he had a scholarship to the Hebrew University in philosophy and math or something of that sort. And his mother and grandmother sat the whole evening crying in Arabic, my flower, my flower, my flower, and it just tore me apart. But it was also the first time that I realized that I had never met Arabs. I live in Palestine, I live in Israel, Palestine, whatever you call it. And I had never known Arabs. Yes, the occasional gardener that came by to ask if I needed fertilizer or something of that sort. But we live, and this is true of most Israelis. And it was an enormous revelation. I'd never thought of it before. And that was part of the learning process, which was rather traumatic, and it took me more than 1 year. My husband joined me, fortunately, and we are, if not 100% on the same wavelength, close enough that we can continue to live together for another 60 years. To begin, I want to begin with the background. You probably know it, those of you sitting here, but just in case, the situation in 1947 was thus: when the UN made the partition, recommended. The UN is not an activating body; it recommended partitioning Palestine into two states. The Jews were 1/3 of the population and owned 6% of the land. And the UN recommended giving 55% of historic Palestine, or Mandate Palestine, to the Jews, which is rather shocking. It's not a good way to begin. Why should 1/3 of the population that owns 6% of the land receive 55% of the land? Apart from that, the minute after this had been going on before, but in 1947 in particular, after the partition was recommended and states acknowledged and recognized Israel. It's not the UN that recognizes Israel. It can recommend. The UN is not an activating body. It recommends. And it is the individual states that recognized Israel, just as now if the Palestinians do go to the UN and ask for, I'm not out of contact last few days, so I don't know what's happening, but if they do go on the 19th or 20th to ask for recognition, it is the individual states that will recognize it. They will go to the General Assembly, but the individual states in the General Assembly, last I heard of, there were 140 that would recognize. I don't know if that is still true or not. And the individual states will make their alliances with Israel, will establish diplomatic relations or whatever. It isn't the UN that creates the division or the states. That should be very clear, because some people think that it is the UN. In any event, after the recommendation of the partition, immediately and even before, ethnic cleansing began. Yes, it is true, as some of you have heard undoubtedly, that leaders told Palestinians to go, that they would be back shortly, but this is the minority of cases. The majority of cases were trucked out or ran away because of fear. For instance, in Deir Yassin, the massacre in Deir Yassin occurred 1 month before the state was declared, and it occurred because the organizations that committed the massacre wanted to clear the road to Jerusalem, and they knew if they committed a massacre in a village which had been on good terms with its Israeli neighbors, not Israeli at that time, they were Jewish neighbors, right? The settlements, the colonies, whatever you want to call them, and there had never been any complaints against them. They even had agreements to warn each other if opposing forces came to attack them. The massacre, there were between 400 to 600 people living there, and the massacre took 100 to 200 lives. There were children, elderly, men, women, it didn't matter. And this caused a lot of the other villages in the neighborhood, a lot of the villagers in other villages to run away, so that it cleaned out, so to speak, the area. And this was done largely, all of this was accomplished largely before the state was actually came into being. That is, the state came into being May 15th, 1948, and by that time, most of the 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians who were evicted had already been evicted. Shortly thereafter, you've undoubtedly heard, 5 Arab countries attacked Israel. The right wing, or people who are pro-Israel, right or wrong, make a lot of this. The poor little Israel was attacked by 5 big countries, but even a historian as Benny Morris was far from being a liberal, and whose attitude is, yes, we did horrible things, but it was necessary or we wouldn't have had a state, says that the Arab armies attacked much too late and too little to do any good. By the time they had attacked, the damage had largely been done. So this was the situation in 1948 when Israel became a state. Now the question that I've asked is, before I come to that, excuse me, the other thing is, was this enough for Israeli leaders? And the answer is no. From even before the state, even before the partition plan, long before, even as early as Herzl, and in the Zionist congresses there was talk about transferring the population from Palestine to other countries and having the whole of the country. Another thing that you find in Zionist tracts, and which interested me and also explained a lot the nature of the country, is that the Jews who were Zionists wanted to turn the Jew from a lamb that you lead to the slaughter type to a militaristic, strong person. A third thing we have to remember that's very important is that the Jews in the Arab countries lived quite well amongst the Muslims. There were no problems. And whereas the Jewish problems, the pogroms and the Holocaust and all that happened had nothing to do with Palestinians. It was largely in Eastern Europe that the Jews were persecuted. I think this is essential to remember, that the Palestinians had absolutely nothing to do with it. Another thing to remember is that had Rommel not been stopped, the Jews in Palestine would have been no safer than they had been in Europe. Okay, my question is has this been good for the Jews? The desire for expansion expressed by even Ben Gurion in 1937, when the Peel Commission first proposed partitioning Palestine. I don't know if you're familiar with the Peel Commission. It was a British mandate, and the Peel Commission was set up because already problems had begun between Jews and Palestinians. And one thing that they wrote was, this is obviously a question of nationalism and not of racism, because Jews and Arabs living in other countries live well together, and there have been no complaints of racism there. Likewise, in Palestine for centuries, from the time at least of the Crusades and beyond, Palestinian, Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in peace. Palestine was largely an agrarian country. 70% of the Muslims worked the land. Jews and Christians were primarily in the cities as merchants and craftsmen. But they lived together in peace, and there was even 1 or 2 villages in which Jews lived along with Palestinians as farmers. Pekin is a very well-known incidence of this. The question that I want to address tonight is, has this expansion and colonization been good for the Jews? It's been terrible for the Arabs, that we all know. But not very often do you ask the question, how has it been for Jews? It's been bad. It's been bad from the socioeconomic situation, which I want to address first briefly. It's not the only cause. There's neoliberal economics, the same thing that you have in America, and your economic situation here is not great either. We have no money for education, no money for social welfare, no money for health, and there's more poverty than there has been before. Now, 47% of the working population lives under the poverty line, which is amazing. 1 of every 3.5 children lives under the poverty line. I could go on and on, but one of the figures that bothers me the most is today there are 60,000 Holocaust survivors. A few years ago there were 80,000, but they're dying off. 60,000 now live under the poverty line. Meanwhile, while this is going on, right, Israel is expanding, is using tremendous amounts of money on the army, on the military, on building new colonies, on building new roads, and the perks are so great in the territories to encourage people to go to the territories, to create the greater Israel, that the population growth, Israeli population growth, not Palestinian, not Arab, is 6%, whereas in Jerusalem it's 2%, and in the rest of the country less than 1%. So that tells you, that figure also tells you that Israel is managing to convince people, not only building, but it is managing to convince people to go. And the perks are at the expense of the population. There have been recently, people have begun to realize that something is wrong, and I will come back to that in a minute. Before that, I want to tell you the other side of the coin, and you have this living in a continuous state of war will show you why I'm going to say what I do now. Israel is a highly militaristic country. But it is also a very dangerous country. And no other country is less safe for Jews. No other country today in the world is less safe for Jews than is Israel. We have lost something like 23,000 security. There's no security, but security. What are so-called security forces. We have lost, since 2000, 1,000 or slightly over 1,000 citizens to all sorts of attacks. The Palestinians have lost during the same period, from 2000 till today, 7,000 or 8,000. So there's no symmetry between an occupier and an occupied, between an oppressor and an oppressed. But nevertheless, you have to realize that Jews are also suffering. And these pages will give you a lot of the background of why I say that. We have had 12 wars, military campaigns, in less than 63 years, actually within 60 years. No Jews have had to suffer those any place else in the world. No Jews have had to suffer the post-traumatic stress symptoms. We have all 18-year-olds are required to go to the army, right? Not all go to the combat units, but nevertheless they are required to. Not all go. Over 50% do not go. 20% of these are excused by the army. They're Arab, include Arab and ultra-Orthodox Jews. And amongst the others, there are various reasons that they either don't go or don't finish. Amongst them are, amongst those that don't go, the 50% that don't go are kids that are highly idealistic, know what's happening, and have decided, these are 12th graders, 11th graders, 12th graders, have decided that they will not participate in the occupation and in the ethnic cleansing of what's going on. Some of these are pacifists. They've discovered at some age that they are opposed to all arms and so on. And some simply are people who are the main breadwinners for the family, even at the age of 18. And these we call gray refusal. And they find ways of getting out of the army because they have to feed their families. So all of this expansion, all of this colonization, all of this mistreatment of the Palestinians is not doing any good for the Israelis. In addition to all the rest, I said, of course, there's a high incidence of post-traumatic stress symptoms. In 2002, a few former officers in the military, for one reason or another, I think one was a doctor, another psychologist, decided to open a rehab center for young people. And they could take 25 to 30 people. And they discovered after about a few weeks that the main reason that these people had become addicted to drugs or to alcohol was because they had been going through the post-traumatic stress symptoms. So they advertised themselves, realizing there probably were more out there. And within a week, they had over 1,000 requests for help. So that this tells you a little bit. This is a country of 5 million people. I know that these numbers are small compared to America, but there are many fewer of us there, right? The country is 7 million, but 5 million are Jews. When kids are brought up, raised to be decent human beings, and then they're faced with doing things to children and to families, to civilians, basically, they pay for it later. In one of the stories that's in these pages, Living in a Continuous State of War, there's a story of 6 women who served in combat units. And there's been a film made of this called See If I'm Still Smiling. It's in English. And I think it's on YouTube. If you can find it, I highly recommend it. One line that is not in the script here, that is on the film, is one woman, some 5-6 years after she's been in the service, says, and has a baby now, she says, I think I'm a good mother. I think I love my child as much as any mother could love her child. But when she cries in a certain way, I cannot control myself. And she ties this in with the fact that things that had happened to her when she was serving in the army. I'm sure this is very similar to stories that you hear from American veterans as well. That doesn't make it better. 2 rights don't make a wrong, and a dozen rights don't make a dozen wrongs don't make a right. So that the situation for Israel is dire, and it gets worse and worse. We now have a government that is extremely right-wing. I would even call it fascist, and it is passing laws right and left that are anti-opposition, anti-human rights groups, anti-Palestinians. How many of these will actually become law, we don't know, because most of them will go to the High Court. But we can't trust the High Court either. It does quite a few things. It has, when the IJC, the International Court, ICJ, the International Court of Justice, said that the famous wall is illegal, our High Court said it's legal. So, and very recently, I don't know if you've heard of Unrecognized Villages, an Israeli concoction for Palestinian villages, primarily in the Negev, but not only. By unrecognized, it means it does not recognize these villages to be legal, even though many of them have been in the Negev prior to the establishment of the state. And it does its best to get the people out. It has built a city in which it wants to deposit these people. The Bedouins are farmers, and they're herdsmen, and you can't herd animals or farm in cities. And this Israel, by the way, is doing the same in Palestine. It's urbanizing Palestine the same way it did Israel proper, what we call Israel proper. By the time the war ended in 1949. Israel had not 55%, but 78% of the land, and then it acquired all the lands after 67 as well. So it's not good for Palestinians, it's not good for Israelis either, and recently Israelis have begun to react. We had a strike by doctors for 5 months, and they recently signed an agreement, I think for 10 years. I haven't read through the whole thing yet. But the residents did not like the agreement that was signed, and over 1,000 of them have quit. I haven't read the papers the last 2 days. I don't know if there was a court injunction against their resigning. They resigned. They were given 30 days for this resignation to go into effect. The last I heard, it went into effect, but then I think there was the hospitals are going to go to court about this, and I don't know what the end result is. But I suspect that there will be many few doctors bred in Israel in the future. They will either go to other countries or look for other professions. Again, immigration has almost dried up. You get a few hundred, maybe a little bit more now a year. Growth in the Jewish population is primarily from birth, not from immigration. And immigration has also grown. I don't have statistics on immigration. First of all, a lot of people don't know they're emigrating. They leave to study or to work or so on and just don't come back. And then the government is not very enthusiastic about giving figures on immigration. On immigration, yes, but not on emigration. But the truth is that the population has almost not grown at all, and the little bit that it has grown is from birth and not from immigration. So Israel is driving up, and I suspect that will there be another war, there will be many more Israelis leaving. What is the solution? The solution has to come from outside. It cannot come from inside. Whatever we do, it's marginal. We keep on. I mean, there are many ways of fighting the occupation. There's showing solidarity for Palestinians by standing with them in their villages and every week and having demonstrations. But these demonstrations have brought very little of the land that has been taken back. You have to understand that in Palestine, unlike America and unlike Europe, farmers do not have a house and their land around the house. In Palestine, all the farmers live in a village, and all the land is outside of the village. So when you build a wall or a fence between the farm and the land and the village, you have effectively taken away the land. The Palestinians lived 400 years under the Ottomans and another 20 some odd under Brits. But neither the Brits nor the Ottomans colonized Palestine. Palestinians continued to live, for better or for worse, but they continued to live as they had lived for centuries under both governments. With Israel, it's quite different. Israel wants Palestinians out, and it does not want to have what we would call peace. It does not want justice. And I have been saying for many years, I have been implying what now there is a book, Israeli rejectionism, which refers to the leaders, that says explicitly what I have been saying implicitly. It says, it begins with the indoctrination that every young Israeli goes through. The two authors of this book, my husband, our children, our grandchildren, have basically gone through the same sort of Zionist indoctrination, which has a very specific Zionist history and narrative, and which is quite different from the narrative that we know to be true. And it is you're trained from a very, very young age to think that you are going to go to the army, and that is going to be where you're going to go to high school and then to the army. This is just part of the scene. A 5-year-old Palestinian child was asked some time back what he wanted to be when he was going to grow up, and he said, well, first I'll go to kindergarten, then I'll go to high school, I'll go to school, and then to high school, and then to jail. because that is the Palestinian vision of where kids end up, and sometimes worse. Whereas in Israel, it's I'll go to kindergarten, I'll go to school, and then high school, and then to the army. I mean, it's just naturally accepted. And this book says no one can deny the fact that all the efforts to bring about peace and end the Palestinian-Israel conflict have failed. The unanswered questions are why they failed and why they continue to do so. This is apparently a debate about cause and effect. For some, the failure of the peace process is related to the Israeli occupation and the growth of the settlement movements. Others argue that Palestinian violence is what led to the failure of peace. Ehud Barak and Dennis Ross argued that the responsibility for the failure lies with the Palestinians, who rejected Barak's generous offers during Camp David II. Others suggest that the growth of Islamic fundamentalism and its dominance among the Palestinians is the cause of failure. The common denominator among these attempts to explain the failure is that the conflict and its consequences are seen as the cause, and the resultant failed peace process is the effect. This book takes a different position. It argues that there is no peace between Israelis and Palestinians after 62 years, now 63 years, because Israel never wanted to achieve peace with its Palestinian neighbors. In recognition of political expediencies and political realities, Israel has consistently proclaimed its commitment to peace, but its consistent strategy was to sabotage any real possibility of peace. It did so because its leadership has always been convinced that peace is not in Israel's interest. We argue that this began even before the establishment of the State of Israel. Indeed, one can detect this conviction even among the early Zionist leaders such as Herzl. I agree with this thoroughly. It took me a long time to realize it, and it's not pleasant to realize it. But there are many examples. For instance, in 1967, when Israel had all that land, it could easily have said, okay, let's make peace, we'll give you the land back, and you have, from the 1967 borders, what you'll have what Jordan had and what Egypt. Because by the end of 1949, Palestinians were entirely dispossessed, because Israel sat on 78% of the land in what is today Israel, plus Jordan had the West Bank and Egypt, Gaza, and the Palestinians were left with nothing. But they still were content, where would Israel leave them, to have, at some point they were content, they said that they would be happy to have a state on the remaining 22%. There's nothing of that left now. There is no room for two states. So when Israel talks about a two-state solution, it's joking. I mean, it's not really serious. The second time that really bothered me was in 2002, when Israel was given the finest possible reason for ending the conflict. What it's called sometimes Saudi Arabian proposal, sometimes the Arab League proposal, but basically what it said was, all the Arab states in the area will recognize Israel as a legitimate state on the proviso, and will normalize all relations with it on the proviso that Israel pull back from to the other side of the 1967 borders. In other words, get out of the West Bank, out of East Jerusalem, and out of Gaza. Israel not only didn't answer it, it ignored it. And that really ate me up. I said, what are these guys doing? Why don't they respond to it? Why don't they give some offer? I'm thinking of our leaders. And there was just absolute silence on the part of our leaders. They did not respond this much. The offer was made again in 2007, and the same no response was evident. So these are two instances, and the book will give you other instances. I highly recommend reading. It's very easy reading. It is not it is not a scholarly book. It is what I would call a primer. But I really do recommend that you, if you're interested in and you care about what is happening between Israel and Palestine, that you read it. And everything that we are going to do, or want to do to end this, has to begin with the assumption that Israel's leaders do not want to end, they don't want Palestinians. So yes, they want peace, but peace on the condition of having the greater Israel, and on the condition that it's empty or almost empty of Palestinians. I think the greater question really is, can any country that grounds itself on one religion, one race, one ethnicity, ever be a democratic group, a democratic country? I frankly today see no difference between a pure Aryan state and a pure Jewish state. And what the pure Aryan state, or the desire for a pure Aryan state, led to, we know. And I think that should be a lesson for all of us to consider. My hope and dream is that we have a single state with equal rights for all its citizens, that these citizens can include anyone of any religion or color or ethnicity that loves the land and wants to be there. And Palestinians are willing to have that. Israel refuses. So this is one aspect. I just want to say a few words about the two organizations to which I belong. One is New Profile, and I'm going to show you. Our purpose is basically to transform Israel. I sigh because we're so far from achieving our purpose, to transform Israel from a militaristic organization to a civilized one. In other words, a civil one. Israel is a highly militaristic society with everything that goes with it. And the second organization is Boycott from Within. And I will talk a little bit more about Boycott after I want to show you a little bit of our exhibit in New Profile. We have succeeded in one respect. We do help youngsters who do not want to go into the army. Every Israeli is obliged to go to the army at the age of 18. There is no excuse for pacifists. Every Israeli has a military profile from the age of 16. He is no longer a child, she is no longer a child that belongs to his parents. From the age of 16, she belongs to the army. New Profile, one of the meanings of New Profile was the hope to give our kids a civilian profile and not a military profile. And that is among one or two other, and perhaps the most important meaning of our name, New Profile. One of the things we do is have an exhibit that is a traveling exhibit, and I want to show you a few pictures from it. And the materials in it are taken from magazines and from newspapers and from textbooks. PR people do not make assumptions. They use our assumptions to sell products, whereas textbooks form assumptions by having, by telling people, by telling children, by having arithmetic lessons of so many soldiers, so many tanks, plus so many tanks make so many tanks, when you could say apples or oranges or something like that instead. When you read, if you read this Living in a Continuous State of War, and I hope you will see that, for instance, in 2002, I think it was, the Ministry of Education sent out a flyer to kindergarten teachers. Make sure for the holidays that you have soldiers come into your room and lecture and tell about the heroism and so on and so forth of those involved in whatever the ritual was for that holiday. So these are a few of the scenes that we have in our exhibit. new profile does not do anything illegal, but we'd be cutting our throats if we did, and we would not be able to help children. But anyone who appeals to us, and we have an open forum, we have a